Thank you for remaining with us at the Lamfalussy Lectures Conference. The current international environment is admittedly highly challenging, and the newly emerged factors put pressure on policymakers to reconsider their practices of forecasting, evaluation, and decision-making. This implies that central banks have to reinvent their policy framework to ensure stability in a world dominated by instability. The first panel discussion, titled Geopolitical Tensions, the Decade of New Risks for Monetary Policy, will delve into the monetary policy implications of the newfound vulnerabilities triggered by geopolitical changes. This panel will focus on how central banks can navigate through these uncharted waters, leading the way to make their economies more resilient to the transformative forces of our interconnected global economy. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Barnabás Virág, Deputy Governor of the Magyar Nemzeti Bank, who will moderate the discussion. And let me also introduce the participants of the panel. Mr. Sylvester Eijffinger, Professor of Financial Economics at Tilburg University and Visiting Professor of Economics at Harvard University. Mr. Marcello Estevão, Chief Economist of the Institute of International Finance. Mr. Jacob Frenkel, Chairman Emeritus of the G30 and former Governor of the Bank of Israel. And Mr. John Lipsky, Senior Fellow at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. Gentlemen, the floor is yours.
Okay, good morning. Good morning to everyone. I have to say that it's not an easy task to continue the conference after the many inspiring and very thought-provoking speeches we heard in the first session. But I'm in a good position because I have brilliant panelists, and I think we will hear also very interesting and inspiring thoughts from our panelists. So the title of the panel is Geopolitical Tensions, the Decade of New Risk for Monetary Policy. So let me start the conversation with an experience on my side. So I started my career in the central bank in 2003. So during that time, we introduced the inflation targeting. So, and of course, we used the one target and one tool approach in the monetary policy. So we had one target, so that's the inflation, and we had one tool, that's the interest rate policy. So the key, the basic rule was, okay, we have to know everything about the cyclical position of the economy, about the cyclical position of the labor market, and of course, if we have all of the information about these indicators, we have a better position to make a forecast about the inflation, and of course, at the end of the day, to deliver the best decisions in the field of monetary policy. If I look at my position nowadays, every morning I start the day to looking at the geopolitical news, to looking at the news in the energy market, what Mr. Trump said yesterday, what are the decisions made by the Chinese government, and so on and so forth. So what's the situation in Ukraine, what's the situation in the Middle East? So it's pretty clear that nowadays we are living in an extraordinary environment. So we have new type of shocks. We have geopolitical tensions. We have energy shock. We had a lockdown after a health crisis. So we can say that we are living nowadays in the age of crisis, maybe. I prefer to say in the age of transitions, because in many fields we can see transitions from one steady state to a new one. For example, green transition, it's worth to look at the digital transition. Also the demographic trends are changing everywhere, and so on and so on. So we face a lot of risk, we face a lot of opportunities. So I want to start with the first round of the question, a very general question from an economic history point of view. The last time when the world economy faced very similar challenges, it was somewhere in the 70s and in the early 80s, where the world economy faced with high and very volatile energy prices, the challenge of stagflation, and we also saw big movements in the field of geopolitics. So my first question to all of the panelists, so what are the similarities of the current environment to that one we had in the 70s and in the early 80s? And of course, what are the key difference points relative to that decade? And of course, what are the key conclusions for the world economy from this extraordinary environment? So I want to start with you. So please, the first 5 minutes.
5 minutes, okay. I try to stick to that. Okay. But let me start. I'm a great fan of soccer. I don't know whether I'm from the Netherlands. We call it football, but others call it soccer. And if we go back to the 70s and 80s and 90s, central banking was very easy. It was like Diego Maradona. You go in straight line to the goal, and sometimes helped with the hand of God. Sometimes with the hand of God, and you scored. Times have changed. Financial markets have become more complicated. Digital currencies, government debt, everything has become more complicated than before. It's comparable with Lionel Messi. And if you look to Lionel Messi, he always zigzag, and zigzag. That's the way he approaches the goal. So central banking, which used to be relatively simple, has become much more complicated. Why? Because the environment has become more complicated. And then, what is then the solution? The solution is to stick to your principles, to the institutions. Madame Lagarde, but also the governor, mentioned the independence of central banks. Sometimes there's a confusion about what independence means. And I worked on this topic for 30, 40 years ago. And there are, I would say, two basic principles which are a kind of trade-off. You have central bank conservativeness. So conservatives in terms of Rogoff. That means the weight on inflation stabilization vis-à-vis output stabilization. That's a famous article of Ken Rogoff in 1985. Then you have also the empirical work by Alex Kuckerman from Tel Aviv University, who also worked, by the way, at Tilburg University at Center as a colleague, a very dear friend of mine, who just passed away, unfortunately. He did this enormous empirical work about developed and less developed countries in terms of empirical evidence. But then there's a difference between conservatives and independents. Independence is the capacity for a central bank to enforce its objection function on policy making, being autonomous. If, and there is a trade-off between conservative and independent, theoretically, in new classical, new Keynesian models, but also empirically, if you are more independent as a central bank, you can afford to be less conservative in terms of the weight on inflation stabilization because of your credibility. That's the nice thing of it. So making a central bank more independent in terms of autonomy to enforce its objection function in terms of price stability gives you the credibility to put less weight on inflation stabilization vis-à-vis output stabilization. But because you need a medium to long run horizon, things have changed dramatically. And why? Because, you know, the crisis, of course, undermined, jeopardized the position of central bankers in terms of credibility, high inflation rates. We cannot, you can say the Ukraine war, yes, indeed, but then energy crisis, all true, but you couldn't deliver. And central banks tried to deliver, as Madame Lagarde also explains. And on the other hand, the political environment changed because of the shorter horizon of politicians. And you can call it populism, whatever name you want to stick to that. But that's not the issue. The issue is that these times, not only from the financial markets perspective, but also from the political environment, you know, the horizon shortened. And then you have the third problem, and that's maybe a forbidden word, but sometimes for politicians, but I want to call it, that's financial repression. And why is that so important? Because we have huge government debts in the US and everywhere. Maybe not in the Netherlands and Germany, or maybe we are spending too less on investment, that's true. I take that point, but you can reduce spending, public expenditure, or you can raise taxes. Both are not very popular. And you have to be re-elected. So politicians don't want it. What is the easy way out? That's the inflation tax. Financial repression is a way of inflating away the real value of your government debt. And you see now that many governments are very much in favor of doing that. I look to the new government, the new administration in the US. The pressure of Trump on the Federal Reserve, and I wrote recently a piece, Project Syndicate. Yes, I will stick to about a minute. And that's, the pressure is there, and the pressure is threefold, and then I'm finished. The first point is political pressure, is moral suasion. That happens with all central banks. That's normal. A central bank governor communicates with the prime minister, the minister of finance. There's nothing wrong with that. The second level of political interference is political appointments. So you need some expertise about central bank and monetary policy to become a central bank governor, at least to my perspective. It's even in the statutes of the ECB. And the Maastricht Treaty explicitly mentioned that you need monetary expertise, proven monetary expertise. And the third level, that's the most, I would say, level of political interference, that is changing the central bank law. So, for example, the Federal Reserve Act can be changed not by a simple majority, but a supermajority in the Senate, because you have this filibuster thing. I'm not an expert on political system of the US, but people explain me that you need at least 60 senators to agree. But it happened before. Under Nixon, there was an adjustment of the Federal Reserve Act. Think about the Humphrey Hawkins testimonies. And that means that from that perspective, and my biggest fear is that in the US, that will happen. Not in Europe, because of the Maastricht Treaty. And how far will President Donald Trump go? And that will influence also the other areas, for example, Europe. So, to conclude, I would say, stick to the basic principles of central bank independence. You can afford to have less, to be less conservative, and try to oppose financial repression. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sylvester. So I think these are very important points. Some months ago, I heard one of the presentation of Charles Goodhart, and he looked at this issue, the central bank independence, from a historical point of view. And one of his conclusion was that the relationship between R and G is a very important indicator to assess the level of central bank independence. So when the G, the economic growth, is faster and larger than the interest rate burden, on that case it's much easier to have very independent central banks. On that case, where the relationship between the two indicators start to change, so the G remain at a low level while the interest rates are in a high level. So on that case, the pressure on the central banks are increasing. So I think that's the case nowadays. So I wanna go to Marcello. So the question is still the same. So why the current environment is so extraordinary in your reading?
First of all, thanks so much for the invitation. It's an amazing pleasure to be in beautiful Budapest and in this great event. I would just make things fun. I'm going to disagree with the premise of the question, and I'll play with my friend Sylvester a little bit. I would argue that every single conference in every single decade says these times are the worst. And we can possibly imagine how it can get worse. And but I will end with a note of optimism. That is, we as economists know much more, and central bankers know much more. So let me just indulge me in going a little bit on the, since you asked about history, the 70s to here. So the 1970s was a hard decade. There was supply shock. There was a burst in interesting academic research on the role of expectations to how central bankers should understand inflation expectations. And that's because we are dealing with this inflation that was going up. And then in the 80s was the decade of the disinflation. And we learned in the 80s that if you let inflation expectations go awry, it's really hard to bring them back in. So you need someone like Volcker to come in and basically raise rates to 20% to kind of re-anchor the system. We've learned of the ills of misconceived fixed exchange rate regimes and the relationship between these regimes and populism. And we have here in the audience Jeffrey Sachs, who was a major contributor into this agenda in the 1980s. Then comes the 90s, and you say, okay, we learn all this, and we had major hyperinflations in the 80s. You had in Brazil, you had in Bolivia, you had Israel. And then we thought, we know inflation expectations are important. We know hyperinflation is awful. What can you do? Oh, let's do inflation target. And one of the first banks to introduce inflation target was the Bank of Israel, under the chairmanship of Jacob Frankel. Then came the 2000s, and the whole discussion was, how can we survive in this world with the global savings glut? What can we do about this? And how do you do monetary policy? And you have the trilemma or dilemma of in macroeconomics. Then came the 2010s, and because of what we did in the first decade of the 2000s, we entered into a period of post-great financial crisis. And then the whole question was, wow, it's really hard to do monetary policy because somehow we cannot get out of being very close to 0% with interest rates. Then the Fed comes in 2020, changed its framework, I would argue wrongly, by changing the framework and looking at the past and say, let's do average inflation target because you need to commit ourselves to not be too hawkish if there is a little bit of inflation. Well, what happened that there wasn't a little bit of inflation. There was a lot of inflation. And we learned that central bankers are actually asymmetric in their reaction function in many ways. They got scared that they waited too long to hike rates in 2022, and they began hiking like crazy. So what did we learn? So why am I optimistic? We learned first that expectations matter. We learned that central bank reputation matters. We learned that transparency can be a quite helpful thing. And these are all things we did not know in the 70s, when the world was equally as complicated as now. There is one thing that makes the world maybe more complicated and kind of puts a little bit of sand in my argument, in my wheels, is that we have this issue of fragmentation. So that is a change in paradigm. And that does complicate the way we think about international coordination of monetary policy. I've seen colleagues of mine, a lot in the private sector, asking me, you know, can we have another Plaza Accord to deal with the dollar appreciation? And this is an anachronic type of, I think, discussion. I don't think you can get, maybe not in the same shape as it was in the 1980s, such an accord going. So that's the part that worries me. And the question is, what are we as an economist going to learn from this current crisis? But we do know more. We do know more. The Fed was able to disinflate with much less cost to the population, if any, and that was remarkable. I mean, in the 70s, that would have taken, I think, much more radical measures to bring inflation down. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. So now, Governor Franco, the floor is yours. So your central bank was the pioneer in inflation targeting. So what are the key messages from that point?
Well, first of all, thank you very much. And like my predecessors, I want to join. Thank you to Governor Matochi and to the central bank for the opportunity to come to Hungary. And as a personal note, I would only say that yesterday I went to visit the place that my father-in-law was born in Budapest, and it was very, very moving, and it showed me that the world did not start yesterday and it will not end tomorrow. There is such a large corpus of history. Number one. Number two, you started with football. For me, as probably the youngest person in this room, I can say that as a child, I remember that my father gave me a gift, and I saw Puskás and Edgar Koti playing, leading the Hungarian team, winning against Germany at the time 8-3, only to be defeated in the finals 3-2, but that's the way it goes. Third, you mentioned that we are in the transition, and we are in the transition. There was a very famous economic thinker, philosopher, Jacob Weiner, who was at the University of Chicago, then went to Princeton, and he spoke about transition, defining it as a transition period is the period between two transition periods. And a transition period is a period in which we live. So we should know that we have a drama every time. But now you forced us to think about the differences that took place in the past 50 years. The time in which we had the supply shocks 50 years ago and the times that we have different supply shocks today. Is this a different world? And in a trivial way, of course it is. But in a fundamental way, I would end, but once you told me that the meeting is over, that my time is done, I would only say, yes, it is a different world, but please don't throw the old textbooks away, because they will come to be useful. Now, about the question itself. In what way are we different than what we used to be, and in what way are we similar? I think that we have learned that supply shocks are extremely important, that they put challenge to monetary policy, that monetary policy alone cannot remove them or solve them. In fact, the previous time that they tried to do it, it generated the stagflation of the 1970s, namely you cannot inflate away a real shock, but by the same token, to the extent that you can contribute to the national debate about the flexibility of the economic system, about the benefits from incorporating and adopting structural policies, which are those policies that remove distortion and make the economy more flexible. These are the conditions that will reduce the cost of supply shocks. Because in many cases, supply shocks that are coming to the system and imposing themselves and reflecting themselves as in relative prices, and that's the starting of the challenge. Relative prices are a very important mechanism of adjustment. As they translate themselves and you try to inflate it away, and they affect the price level to the extent that you are unable to remove the aggregate effect through monetary policy, that's when it becomes price level. Price level, if it is not temporary, it becomes inflation. And if it is inflation, it becomes expected inflation. And then suddenly the machinery starts going. And what started as a supply shock, which you could not and should not have inflated away, transforms itself into demand and supply shocks because you failed to draw the distinction. And that's an important lesson. Third, many of the supply shocks are brought to us through the foreign sector. And that's where the theme of geopolitics come in. And, you know, life was very simple, as you told us at the beginning, when the objective was price stability, you had the machinery, you had interest rates, etc. But the world has changed. We were in a different conference in the BIS with Andrea, where the subject had to do with, I introduced at least the discussion, Ralph Hotrick. Ralph Hotrick is a British English economist who wrote, and none of you, most of you do not know his name, but he wrote one of the, at the time, the classic textbook about central banking. It has nothing to do with the current central banking. And you will realize that indeed many things have changed, but some principles remained. And let me just make two statements and I will finish because the chairman showed me the time. Number one, what we've learned is that you cannot and should not encourage economic growth through inflation. Trivial, but many people try. Next, budget deficits do not promote growth. Trivial, but by ignoring it, we generated the debt problem. Debt problem is not just an issue of governments, because there is private debt and public debt, and in many cases, the differences are blurred because the public sector tries to save the private sector. So when all is said and done, there are many differences, of course, during the past 50 years. Even the players changed. There was a USSR, there was no ECB, there was no euro, and all of that, but let's not get confused. Fundamentals are still in place. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Governor. Last but not least, I want to turn to Mr. Lipsky. So what's your reading of the current situation from a historical point of view?
Very good, thank you. And let me also join thanking Governor Matocci for the invitation to be here, and congratulations to the governor and to the whole central bank on its anniversary, its centennial anniversary. Quite an achievement. Now, the risk of being the last speaker on a talented panel is that everything will have been said, but not everyone will have said it. So allow me, I'm going to look at an aspect that hasn't really been dealt with yet, contrasting what's happening now with what happened back in the 70s. The starting point in the 70s, remember, at the beginning was the Bretton Woods dollar exchange system, was a fixed exchange rate system that depended on the monetary policy of the United States. And in a divided world in which the Soviet Union had created Comecon, which there wasn't free trade between the areas, in which China and India basically were not participants in the world economy. And what happened? The US policy grew out of balance, became inflationary, produced a breakdown of the Bretton Woods system in a context in which there essentially was no international capital market in the way we know it today. And what were the implications of that breakdown and those tensions that we've talked about already, and you all know? One was the creation of the challenge to all the central banks to control their own monetary destiny independently and to set their own inflation targets as opposed to the previous system of the dollar exchange system. At the same time, again, to this could be a long story, but the short story is it set in motion not only greater independence for central banks or greater challenges for central banks, but also impetus for broader development of the world trading system and ultimately the growth of what we know today as international capital markets. In other words, it set in motion a period of greater integration of the world economy in terms of trade in goods and services and in terms of financial integration as well. Carry forward into the 1990s, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the entry of China and India into the world trading system, and this became supercharged. So we've been living since the 70s in a period of increasing integration in trade, increasing integration in finances, and then came the global financial crisis. Since that time, global GDP has been growing faster than global trade for the first time since not just the 1970s, since the 1950s. And if the challenge today is, are we reforming back into economic blocks with new trade barriers between them? And that certainly seems to be the concern now, the obvious concern. And at the same time, what's creating tension, is going to create tension, is first technology and the dramatic growth in trade in services. The past, we always thought of trade in things, but now trade in not things, in ideas, is growing rapidly and has a very different character than trade in goods. Secondly, the technology is creating the possibility of financial integration in a way that didn't exist before. In other words, a digitally tokenized financial system creates the possibility of instantaneous settlement with high level of security, including between across borders and between currencies. So on the one hand, for the first time since the 1970s, we're beginning to think, are markets closing down rather than opening up? At the same time, the technology is telling us exactly the opposite. This is a different challenge than we had before, but it's very real, full of opportunities and full of risks. That's it for me.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lipsky, and thanks for bringing the trade story into the house, because that's my second topic to the panel. So of course we can see very clear consequences on the side of trade from the geopolitical tensions. So nowadays we can see rising trade tariffs, rising number of trade restrictions. So of course the key question: what can be the future of the globalization in this situation? So can we expect that somewhere in the near future the globalization will strengthen further because of the new technologies, because of the digitalization, or we have to prepare for a multipolar world again as we had before the 90s in case of the trade? So what can be the future in that field? So please, you are the first.
Okay, thanks. You know, economists are not great futurologists, so I'm not. The basic answer is I have no idea. Okay, but you asked me the question, so I'll try to have an idea about what's going to happen. I think there is a discussion between a bipolar world, and they don't mean in the schizophrenic way, but maybe it is. But I mean, it's the U.S. pole and the China pole, and it's a multipolar world. I think we are gradually, now with the election of President Trump, not so gradually, moving toward a direction where people are much more focused on their national problems. And the whole idea of having rules to deal with problems that basically international, where coordination would be quite important, like climate policies, which is the biggest, maybe the biggest challenge of this generation, is how now that we know more, we learned, like we learned about how to do monetary policy, also learn about the consequence of our activities on climate. So, and we know that to deal with them is much better to collaborate, not to be confrontational about it. So I think in this world where things are more confrontational, I can see poles of groupings forming more. So we have now the BRICS countries trying to think about using their own currency for trading. Then you have people that have to choose, or countries have to choose, do I get closer to the BRICS or do I get closer to the US? Europe is in this middle here, is a very complicated position for Europe. Very complicated position for some of the large emerging markets because they tend to have tight relationship with the US, but also with China and others. So I think there'll be less collaboration, less coordination. Globalization is going to continue because, like John said, is a technological almost inevitability, but it will be much more fragmented, it will be much more combative. And in that world, countries that take positions like the US is taking on trying to punish countries because they are doing this or that, in particular vis-a-vis the dollar, actually increase the probability that those other blocks will end up showing up, like using the dollar as a weapon, as a part of sanctions. So that is an issue. Anyway, you don't want to talk about the central bank. So I think, again, we are going to live in a more in a globalized world with more friction. And that increases uncertainty, and uncertainty is not good for growth. It's not good for trying to fight inflation. So that's going to make the job of central banks more complicated.
Okay, thank you very much, Governor Frankel. So still the question is the future of globalization, and my question, Israel is very similar to Hungary in that field, is a very open economy. So what does it mean for the small and open economies, and what does it mean for the central banks in the small and open economies?
Well, 2 points. First, a small country cannot afford cutting itself from the world. Second, small countries' policies will not change the nature of the shocks of the world. So the only thing that a smaller country can do is resilience. Make sure that you are protected from shocks that will come from the rest of the world. And here the recipe is the very standard one, and I saw outside a lot of books, and all of them at the end of the day follow the principles of how to increase resilience of an economy, and I already said something at the beginning about it. When it comes to globalization, let's not be confused. The fact that the Washington Consensus is out, that there is some movements of fragmentation and deglobalization, etc., does not mean that there is a lesser degree of interdependence. When you sneeze, your neighbor gets pneumonia, whether or not is the trade relationships between you or whatever. The only thing is that with the collapse of the machinery of globalization, many of the tools that were used in order to internalize the externalities that come from the world are missing. So it makes it more difficult. The interdependence is still there, and the challenges are still there. So let's not kid ourselves. Even politics cannot remove the law, Newton's law. So this is really the realities, number one. Number two, since you mentioned, I'll just go very quickly about it, tariffs. If there is one topic, and I'm sure I did a poll here because a lot of people here are economists in nature, what do you think about tariffs? In principle, everyone will say, from David Ricardo onwards, that we know that the tariffs are costly, that most of the objectives that tariffs generate can be generated in different ways, less distortive, etc., etc. And yet, it is clear that it is a very typical and attractive tool of policy, especially of incoming presidents of a large country. So that's why we need to ask ourselves, where did we go wrong in the public education, and what is missing to make sure? And obviously, I think that what is missing, like always in public policies, that the beneficiaries from a policy are not capable of compensating the losers from that policy, and therefore, the losers are more noisy and maybe are more successful to change the public debate. But this is really the issue. One thing is clear. It seems that we are going to an era in which there will be more tariffs than before, but we need also to remember that now the language is, we are not going just to let you do it to us, and you will see retaliation. We know that in a world in which the rules of the game are an eye for an eye, this is the world in which there are a lot of blind people. So in other words, the trade wars will generate victims, and let's not forget the root causes for that, the attempt to improve, in quotation mark, the lot of the destination and the destiny of our citizens. Wrong. So I think that we need to fasten our seatbelts and make sure that trade wars are minimized in terms of their frequency, and remind people what happened in the last time. There was a very well-wishing senator and congressman in the United States named Smoot and the other one named Hawley, and they jointly passed the Smoot-Hawley legislation in the United States to protect the weak, to protect the zombie companies, and to do this and that. And at the end of the day, the Great Depression emanated. So we need to remind people that history can repeat itself, and we better prevent it from happening. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Mr. Lipski.
First, of course, I agree with everything Jacob has said. Let me just add the following three observations. One, let's look at what has happened in an area where there has been a lot of sanctions and interference in markets, and that's the energy markets post the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And what we find, of course, is big changes in the way energy flows. What you find is that at the end of the day, everybody wants to get a hold of what they feel they need. And as a result, very few countries have made important changes in the underlying demand for energy. So what we have created with all these sanctions basically is a very inefficient, much more fragile, and much more costly distribution for energy, in which no one has benefited and everyone has become at greater risk and less efficiency, point one. Point two, at the risk of being a little cheeky, I'm going to quote the former Swedish Prime Minister Carl Bildt in saying that we can say about the big blocks, economic blocks in the world, China is the champion of production, the United States is the champion of innovation, and Europe is the champion of regulation. But what we can see is that everybody wants innovation. And the point being, is really following on a point I made earlier, innovation involves trade in ideas and services. And that proves to be very hard to create sanctions to prevent trade in ideas. So in attempting to do so is going to be analogous to what's happened with energy. The more we interfere, the more it's going to be inefficient, fragile, and costly, and in the end, there will be no winners. So we should take, and we should move forward in that context and realize that most of the talk we're hearing about trade and interruption of trade and interruption of commerce involves a backward-looking view of what constitutes trade and commerce and finance. Instead, we should be concentrating on where we're headed.
Thank you very much, Sylvester. You have the closing words in this round.
Very wise words by my colleagues. And I want to add to that, to beware of the 3Ds. The 3Ds. I'm very, you know, the Politicians are short-sighted, short horizon, but the financial markets as well. What is the horizon of financial markets? 1 year? 2 years? Maybe a little bit more? But for more than 2 years, everything is long-term. This is just a little bit crazy. That causes a lot of volatility in the market. And actually, I gave a speech which tried to give more a medium, longer-term perspective. And if you go to the demography, we know that there will be these savings. People become older. People will have saved for the pensions, healthy costs, so Alzheimer, Parkinson, all kinds of welfare diseases. So there will be these savings by the elderly because these density functions of 70 plus, 80 plus, 90 plus are increasing. That's costly in the Western, in the US, in Europe. So that means less supply of loanable funds. Second, decarbonization. Of course, President Trump said, I revoke the Paris Accord. Of course, but let's be honest, the train is on the way. The train is on the way. The companies are, the Green Deal, the Inflation Reduction Act. Can you undo that, what has been done and set in motion? So the climate transition will increase the investments enormously, and thereby the demand for loanable funds will increase. So the real interest rate, we spoke about the real interest rate of growth, so Ben Bernanke's saving glut, what he always mentioned, is not anymore there. The real interest rate should increase. Then the deglobalization, reshoring, or how you want to call it, means that we, whether it's because of safety reasons or food or military reasons, we're reshoring production. That means higher labor costs. Higher labor costs means higher inflation expectations. So you have the real interest rate, ex ante, you have the inflation expectation, which will increase, and then on top of that, you have the risk premia. Of course, they are mutually correlated to some degree, we know that. But now, with the unpredictability, the uncertainty induced by the new US president, there's a lot of uncertainty. We know what happens when there's a lot of uncertainty. Financial markets translated a higher risk premia. So there we see in the medium to long run, 1, higher real interest rates. 2nd, higher inflation expectations. 3rd, higher risk premia. Thus, in the medium to long run, higher capital market interest rates in nominal terms. Yeah, I'm not hopeful. Sorry.
Okay, thank you very much, Sylvester. You mentioned 3 Ds as a challenge, so let me mention another D, the D like digitalization. So I strongly believe that the digitalization can support us to tackle the mentioned challenges somewhere in the future. Now I want to open a new round, and the topic of the new round is the global currency system. So I think we know well from the history that the geopolitical world order is strongly tied to the global currency system. So nowadays on that field we can see, I think, at least two big trends. One trend is the mentioned geopolitical tensions, that nowadays we are moving into a multipolar world again. And the other trend is the new technologies, the technological process, the emerge of digital currencies. So my question, what can be the future of the global currency system within this environment? And I want to start with this round with Governor Franco.
Well, thank you. There was a period during the Vietnam War that the conclusion of discussions, academic discussions and policy discussions was, well, the dollar has lost its value and its shine, and we need now to go for alternatives. And at that time, also, the euro or the European system started to wake up, and the dream was there. And of course, the European crisis put this dream to rest, and suddenly the choice of a currency for the world has been dominated by political discussions that ended up by the Chinese pressure to add their currency to the basket of SDR, as if this changes the world currency system. Let me make one statement, which is, you do not legislate a leading currency. You have to earn the status of a leading currency. And there are some criteria that at least the markets want you to earn and demonstrate. And the criteria is a record of stability, a record of strong legal system, a record of respect for property rights, a record of deep capital markets, a record, etc., etc. And it is in this regard that the last time that we saw a fundamental change in the world's central currency was when the sterling lost its status to the dollar. And there is no question that the euro has proven to be a success. To me, the crisis of the euro that was, say, 10 years ago, whatever, really was a watershed. This was the fork on the ground that showed that if you were able to sustain and survive this crisis without having exits from the euro and all the rest, it means that the experiment was a success and that the Lamfalussy dream was there. By the same token, it's not a picnic. You really need to work hard at it and earn it, and there will be ups and downs. But I want to remind you one thing. In a conference which was almost a decade ago, the speaker spoke about, people were insulted, about the pigs. And the pigs were Portugal, Ireland, Greece, Spain, that are countries that are the most challenged down-the-drain countries. Fast forward, what are the countries that are now fastest growing in Europe? Now they will not call it pigs anymore, but they will say Portugal, Ireland, Greece, Spain, you name it. Who was the leader for many years? Germany. Who is now carrying the continent down? Germany. What it means to me is that we really need to have a longer-term perspective, and the rise and fall of currencies is part of the dynamism, like in a human organ or in living organ. Some things are rising, some are falling, but the fundamental bodies stay. And what is the fundamental body? I really, with all the skepticism that people have had about the euro, I think that it passed the test. But I want also to say that the real issue in policy is not the choice between the optimal and the suboptimal. That's in textbooks. But in life, the choice are between two suboptimal systems. None of them will be optimal. And therefore, we are in a second-best world. And what have we learned in the second-best world? We have learned that at the end of the day, you need to make choices, and in our world of the financial markets, the choices have to do with risk management. And if it is risk management, and it is the pricing of risk that carries the day, we need to ask, what do we compare? Is every day another test? And I would say no. The test of a boat is during a storm, not during tranquil period. And if it is during a storm, then the test of a country is resilience. And I repeat again, resilience, resilience, resilience. And the fact that there are periods of ups and downs should not be dramatic in this particular case. So the rise and fall in currency, if I have to forecast, I would say that when we meet here, hopefully in the next birthday or whatever you call it, and we will all be here, of course, we will see that the leading currency of the world is still the dollar, and that the many competitors want to be similar to it, and therefore the world will be a safer place. But supervision and regulation is still extremely important. Thank you.
Mr. Lipske, please.
Yes, and as usual, I agreed with Jacob. But let me add to his boat analogy. Ships are safe in the harbor, but that's not what ships are for. And so what we can see is, our friend Mario Draghi in his recent report drew a direct connection between innovation, productivity growth, and the financial system, the need to develop a deeper, more varied, more flexible capital markets in Europe to be able to compete globally in economic terms, not just financial terms. And that requires completing the banking union, completing the capital markets union, et cetera. So there are things that can be done. But as Jacob said, and it's so obvious, it's market participants will choose the reserve currency. But to be a reserve currency requires all these flanking institutions and a history and credibility. And that takes a while to accomplish. I'll stop.
Thank you very much for the clear messages. I want to continue the story with you, Sylvester.
I completely agree with Jacob and John, but then nobody mentioned the Draghi report.
I just did.
Where's the Draghi report? Huh? Draghi is not here, but the Draghi report, is, floating there in the cloud, and we should discuss the Draghi report. And the Draghi report is a very interesting macroeconomic analysis. What's wrong with Europe? Let's be honest. Germany has now a growth of 0.0%. That's amazing. And if you compare the period of 10 years or 15 years ago, when you had the hedge reforms by the Chancellor Schröder, there is a need to have reforms in Germany, even in my own country, the Netherlands. We were always so trustful that we are an innovative country. Of course, we have Estevão and all these innovative industries around Eindhoven. But now comes the important point. This discussion has not been closed. Why? Look to what happened in Germany with the fall of the German government. Why was that there? Habeck, the Minister of Economic Affairs, came with his Deutschland fund, the Deutschland Germany fund. And then he said, yeah, but we have to finance it publicly. Maybe Eurobonds, but publicly. He was backed by Chancellor Scholz. At the other side of the ocean was the Minister of Finance, Lindner, FDP, who was astonished by this position because he is proponent of the capital market union, private funding. This will be the discussion about the Draghi report. We agree that we have to innovate in Europe. Of course we have to innovate. But then the question is, how do we finance it? Is it public funding? Eurobonds, what Draghi is also saying? Or is it private funding? The answer is, of course, both. Both. Because if you do public funding, you know that is enormous adverse selection and moral hazard problem. You cannot avoid that. That will be a misuse of public funds. So you need the private sector. But for the private sector, you need a capital markets union and completion of the European Banking Union. So I think one of the biggest messages of today for the Draghi report is that we have this discussion and conclude how to finance it. And then, of course, there will be public funding, but the finishing of the capital markets union is key is really key. And then we get deeper capital markets, which can compete with a little bit with the US capital markets, which is the biggest, deepest market in the world. The dollar has its role, its international role as a key currency because of that, and has the seigniorage, and has all the advantages of the deep capital markets, lower risk premia, and we don't have that. So the completion of the Capital Markets Union and the European Banking Union are really key for completing the Economic and Monetary Union.
Thank you very much. Marcello, please.
Yeah, since I agree with what was said before, let me just say that I do agree with your list of conditions that the market price, and then decide what's the reserve currency. But as we all know, this is not manna from heaven. It didn't come from any, there is no predestination of the US dollar or anything like that. So institutions do matter. And then it is worrisome, the risk of on these institutions themselves. So I'm not, next year, yes, the dollar is going to continue being a reserve currency 2 years from now, maybe 10 years from now. But if you look at US fiscal policy, which is atrocious, if I were still a mission chief at the IMF and I'm going to a country with such fiscal policy, believe me, there will be a very different staff report than if I'm going to the US. And that's not because there's anything special about the US. It's because of the history of respect for institutions, the history for fiscal responsibility, is the history of respect for the Constitution, and for respect for independence of the Fed. So all these are important things. And when I said semi-jokingly that I can't predict the future, what I meant is, really, I can't control the future. And I think it would be too much to expect that the US would still have such a position in the international financial system, say 50 years from now, if institutions get corroded, given the list that matters for the market. And I do get concerned. You see long-term rates in the US are going up, and there are many views of why it's going up, but I think it's quite related also to the fiscal outlook for the US. It's quite related to an increased risk premium, even to hold US debt is increased to the saturation of the market for the issuing of bonds. There is a limit. It's a safe asset, but there's a limit of how much people want to hold that bond. And you see mortgage rates in the US just hit 7%, 30-year mortgage rates like some weeks ago. That all fits together with the situation of deterioration in institutions, and we should be concerned about that.
Thank you very much. Our time is pretty close to the end, but let me open a last round, a last very quick round. So till now we touched the geopolitical tensions, the trade war situation, the 3Ds, the future of the currencies. But of course, in the room we have a lot of central bankers. So my last question, and I would like to ask a very quick 1 or 2 sentence reaction for that. So we are flying in a very turbulent environment. Also, the central bankers are flying in a very turbulent environment. So what are your key messages to the central bankers nowadays? How we can provide the needed stability in our economies in this extraordinary environment? So, please, Mr. Lipsky.
Quick remark for central bankers. The trend in financial markets is away from traditional banking towards capital markets. Central banks in the past have had, in many cases, have only a weak grasp on the facts and figures of what's happening in the non-bank financial sector, which is likely to be important for producing financial stability in the future.
Thank you. Sylvester?
Well,
central bank independence?
Yeah, no, something different. Something different. Communication. One of my mentors, who passed away in December 23rd, was Helmut Schlesinger, the president of the Bundesbank, before there was an ECB. Mr. Bundesbank. He was the personification of the Bundesbank. And I learned a lot from him. I succeeded on his chair in Humboldt. But then he said very wise words. And you know, there's a saying about the Germans. Not all Germans believe in God, but they all believed in the Bundesbank. Yeah. Why? And then Helmut Schlesinger explained to me why. He said, because the Gesetz über die Deutsche Bundesbank, the Bundesbank law, can be changed with simple majority in the Bundestag and the Bundesrat. So in both chambers. So that's the reason why we communicate with the people. Over the heads of politicians, it's very important that the central bank, and you're doing that fine, I think you did that marvelously, to communicate with the Hungarian people, communicate with your people, to get the support of the people for the independence, the position, the respected position of the central bank. Independence without accountability, because those are the two sides of the same coin, needs communication. So that's my point.
Okay, thank you, Marcello.
Briefly, we already said, I mean, stick to the basics. There may be one or two chapters in the new textbook that you may need to, revise, but stick to the basics. Pay attention what is a supply shock, what is not. Keep inflation expectations well anchored. You can control how the world is going to change, but you can control what you do. So maybe being a central bank is one area that too much creativity may not be great. So I would say, again, stick to the basics. We know what the textbooks say. Be transparent and professional about it.
Okay. And the closing words from Governor Franco.
Yes, thank you. One of the main differences, you started by talking about 50 years ago and now, and you go even 80 years ago to the creation of the Bretton Woods organizations. And now is the role of capital markets, the role of financial markets. I was participating in the discussion of the policy coordination during the 80s, and that's just to remind you, the signatories on the Plaza and the Louvre Accords were just the Ministry of Finance. Central banks were not invited to the room. They were just the executing arm of the decisions of the governments. This is not there anymore. The capital markets are there, which also means that the system behaves like in a financial system. Namely, system has memories, so don't play games with it. Second, systems are anticipatory, which capital markets are for, rather than waiting for things to happen. And therefore, being behind the curve is almost contradiction in term for policies that are anticipatory. But how do you do anticipatory in policy? You cannot ignore models. And models lost their shine recently. But let's face it, we are in a complex world, a world for professionals. And therefore, the fact that models led us astray only means that the past is very different than the future. But it does not mean don't study well what has happened and try to improve your forecast of the future, and that's for the professionals. And finally, when I said don't mess around with it, because it's fragile, think about the packages that say handle with care, it's fragile. And indeed, when it comes to financial markets, it's even more fragile. And the reason is that the outcomes reflect not just the markets, but also the regulations, the abusive, occasionally, regulation, and the supervisions. And occasionally, the referees in a soccer game, to return to the first analogy, are disturbing the game, and occasionally they facilitate the game. So the orchestra, as we listened last night to the chamber music, must be harmonious, otherwise we will not enjoy it. Thank you very much.
Okay, so I think it's a great closing word. I want to stop here, and I want to thank to the inspiring talks, to our panelists, and of course, I want to thank your attention. To our audience, I think using these takeaways we got from our panelists, we have a much better chance to provide a more stable world in the world economy. So thank you very much again.
Virág, distinguished speakers, thank you very much for this valuable discussion. Ladies and gentlemen, now it's time for a short coffee break, and then we will continue with another panel discussion.